In the previous lesson, we started walking through the index.js file, and I mentioned that the entire React app was kicking off or initializing with one top-level component, which is app. We can actually see it right here on line number 10, and I do realize that the syntax may be a little bit weird, but this is fundamentally the core component that is launching the React application. You can think of a top-level parent component as a top-level element in HTML. For example, in our HTML file, the body element is really the one that is housing all of the actual smaller children elements that are being rendered onto the screen. It's sort of the same idea here. We can start our app off with a top-level component, which will in turn render all kinds of other components within it. But the key takeaway is app is that component for this application. And app is actually being imported right here on line number 4 from the app.js file. So let's go ahead and open that file up. And when we do, we're going to see a couple interesting things. So I want you to take a moment to pause and think about what you see in this file and why it might look a little bit weird to you, right? So if I was discovering React for the first time as you are, I might read this file from top to bottom and say, okay, lines 1 and 2 look totally normal to me. They're just regular import statements. On line number 4, we're defining a function called app. And then on line number 25, we are exporting it out of the file. This is all regular, traditional, vanilla JavaScript. But then I might look at the return value of my app function, this logic right here, and this is where my head might get a little bit confused, right? Because remember, we're in a JavaScript file, and yet right here we see code that really looks like HTML, right? And it looks like HTML, and VS Code is not giving us any kind of errors or warnings. It's totally valid. In regular JavaScript, we're used to returning things like strings and numbers and arrays. How could we possibly be returning something that looks like HTML, right? Well, this is kind of a core fundamental feature of React, and it is called JSX. So the code that we're seeing on lines 6 through 21 isn't actually HTML, although it looks remarkably close to it, and that is by design, but it is not HTML, it is actually JSX. Now, the React docs call JSX a syntax extension for JavaScript. And if you think about what that means, it means that it is new syntax that is being introduced to make you do more things with JavaScript. We're going to talk more about what that means in just a second. The first thing to know is that JSX is specifically tied to the React library. This was invented with the React library to make it easier to work with React, right? So it's intrinsically tied to the React library. You have to pretty much know JSX to be a React developer today. All right, so what is JSX? JSX is code that looks like plain HTML, but behind the scenes, under the hood, it really is just JavaScript function calls within the React library, okay? So what we're seeing right here is actually a little bit deceptive. It's a little bit of an illusion. This is not really HTML, it just looks like it. And the reason for this is because the React development team wanted something that was convenient for us to use. Another term you might hear in the community is that this is an abstraction. Something that is an abstraction is a simplicity that covers up something that's a lot more complex under the hood. So under the hood, when this code runs through Babel, our transpiler, to become what we see in the browser, this is actually becoming JavaScript function calls and method calls within the React library. There's no actual real HTML that is being written in this file. It's just that JSX gives us the appearance of HTML, and when this code is parsed by Babel, it understands, hey, this div right here, this should be a method call in the React library. And this header right here, this should be another method call within the React library. So this is an illusion. It is not HTML. It is code that looks and functions pretty much just like HTML, but that allows us to use the features of HTML, but really under the hood, it's all JavaScript, right? Now you might be thinking, but why is this helpful? Well, we'll come to understand that the more we explore React, but the primary reason is because we gain all the benefits of a programming language like JavaScript, but now we get to incorporate it with ideas like creating a dynamic user interface. And that can be really powerful, right? As a very basic example, if we think back to our components lesson where we talked about YouTube and the 8 video cards, right? If you wanted to render 8 of the same thing on the screen, Well, in HTML, you really would have no option, right? You would have to copy and paste the same thing 8 times in the file to see the result. But in a programming language, one helpful feature we're always going to have is something like iteration, right? We can do a for loop to iterate 8 times. Well, imagine using the power of JavaScript to say, iterate 8 times, and 8 times add this same chunk of HTML to the DOM, right? That is something that is not available in HTML because it doesn't have those programmatic features. Well, JSX lives up to that same standard. The reason it's beneficial to us is because we can use all the benefits of the power of programming to more quickly and rapidly and dynamically build up user interfaces. But if we were just writing plain JavaScript function calls, as we'll come to discover when we dive into React more in depth later on, it would actually be remarkably laborious and verbose and require a lot of code due to the mechanics of how the React library works. So what the React development team said is, why don't we give the user this incredible thing they already know that is HTML, right? People know how to write divs and headers and images and paragraphs. And behind the scenes, we'll take this code that they think is HTML, it really isn't, and we'll translate it to all of those verbose JavaScript function calls so they don't have to worry about it. And what those JavaScript function calls in the React library fundamentally do is they create the elements and they render them to the screen. It's a very, very, very high level introduction, and I know that some of this can be confusing. Again, the key takeaway here is that JSX is an illusion. It is an abstraction. It is a set of instructions for HTML content that will eventually appear on the screen that will be generated by React and JavaScript. What we're seeing here gives us the illusion and the comfort and convenience of writing code that looks like HTML, but it really is JavaScript under the hood. That's why it's a syntax extension for JavaScript, because it is something that really is just giving us more features in JavaScript to use. Now we can write code that appears to be HTML in JavaScript, but really isn't. It's just JavaScript under the hood. But let's build up these ideas from scratch. Let's start very low because I know looking at this whole chunk of code can be very confusing. So let's start with super simple building blocks and build up one step at a time. So in order to do that, what I want you to do is to highlight everything in this file and just comment it out. All right, so now we have commented everything out. In VS Code, by the way, you can do that by pressing Command plus the / on a Mac or Control and the / on a Windows computer. So now we basically have this file completely commented out, but we are welcome to write whatever code we want in here. And in fact, we can write valid JSX anywhere we want in this file. It doesn't have to be within a function in React. So why don't we write some sample code to finish this lesson off? I just want to write something that looks like a basic H1 HTML element, and I just want to give it the text Hello React. And that I hope will just serve to be a much smaller example than this complexity right here. What we have on line number 4, again, is JSX. I know it looks like HTML, but it's not. What this is, fundamentally under the hood, is a call to a method on the React library that will tell React to generate an H1 for us and eventually put it on the screen and to give it the inner text content of Hello React, right? We have the full comfort of writing something that looks like HTML, but isn't. It's just a JavaScript under the hood. And this syntax right here is called JSX. So if you were hearing about JSX in the community and you were worried about learning it, I have a really good bit of news for you. You already know it because you already know HTML, right? If you know HTML, you pretty much already know JSX. There are some bells and whistles and there are a couple tweaks that we need to make, but for the most part, writing JSX is as simple and as intuitive as the HTML you already know, which explains why the React development team created it in the first place, right? It's to give you this abstraction layer, this facade over the real JavaScript that they wrote to make it easy for you to write your apps, to write your UIs, and not have to think about that actual JavaScript complexity that goes under the hood. So just remember, behind the scenes, this is going to be translated to JavaScript and React code. And React is written in JavaScript. So this is going to be translated to programming code, JavaScript code. But to us, it looks like regular HTML. I apologize for repeating 100 times, but I know this concept can be pretty confusing. So hopefully this makes sense. And in the very next lesson, we're going to start talking about some of the advantages that we get from being able to combine this syntax with core JavaScript constructs like variables and arrays and more. So we'll start digging away at that in the very next lesson, and I'll see you there.